Question. Why do you have an obligation to obey the law? Possible answer. Because you gave consent to be subject to the laws. With this exchange, it would be quite reasonable for you to give the following response. Wait a minute. I never gave consent. Nobody ever asked me if I wanted to be subject to the laws. They just started enforcing them on me. Consent theory is one of the most popular, or is the most popular, theory for accounting for political obligation. The theory gained dominance in the 1600s in the writings of Thomas Hobbes in the book Leviathan. 4 decades later, John Locke presented a more famous version of consent theory in his second treatise on civil government. Locke's version was published shortly after England's Glorious Revolution, where the English Parliament effectively fired King James II and brought in a new pair of monarchs, William and Mary of Orange. This fairly well exemplified the principle of a monarch getting its power from the consent of the governed, and the governed, in this case Parliament, provided the new monarchs with a contract limiting sovereign powers. Locke's consent theory also got written into the Declaration of Independence, quote, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, end quote. Consent is like giving a promise or signing a contract. You agree to do something, so now you have an obligation to do it. You agree to be governed by the laws of the United States, so you must obey the laws of the United States. But still, the problem exists. You never actually gave your consent. In particular, I'm going to wager that you didn't sign the Constitution of the United States, nor were you a member of any of the ratifying committees. I recognize that this is an assumption on my part. This assumption is wrong. Well, there may be a case for your consent. But what about the people who voted no? Did they consent? Or the people not allowed to vote, but who are still placed under the rule of the Constitution anyway? Did they consent? People who voluntarily choose to become citizens may be said to have actively given their consent. And foreign visitors may be said to be under an obligation to obey the laws since they came here voluntarily, and consent to be governed by the laws of the United States may be considered an implicit part of allowing them into the country. But this applies to very few people. Perhaps, as was the case with foreign visitors, something you did resulted in your giving tacit or implied consent to obeying the laws. It's like when you borrowed your friend's pickup so that you could move your furniture to the new apartment. You may not have explicitly agreed to return the pickup with a full tank of gas or a fully charged battery, but it is, at least in many cultures, assumed that you would do so. On this idea of tacit consent, Locke wrote the following, quote, and to this I say that every man that hath any possession or enjoyment of any part of the dominions of any government doth thereby give his tacit consent, and is as far both obligated to obedience to the laws of that government during such enjoyment as any one under it, end quote. So, if you're here enjoying the benefits of this government, you have tacitly agreed to abide by its laws. If you don't agree to obey its laws, well, you can leave. However, in order for something to count as consent, certain conditions have to be met. For one thing, an individual has to be aware of the fact that they're given consent. For example, in the case discussed above, where you borrowed a vehicle, the obligation to fill up the gas tank or recharge the battery requires that you be aware of this custom when you borrowed the truck. And yet it's unlikely that many people were aware of the fact that just by living in a country, they're giving consent to live by that country's laws. Robert Klosko, in his article on the consent theory of political obligation, wrote, quote, one must be aware that tacit consent is called for, and how one goes about giving it and not giving it. One must be aware of the period of time, if there is one, during which one may or may not consent. One must also be aware of what one would be committing oneself to, and the fact that this commitment would not exist unless one consented. End quote. If somebody were to hand you a flower as you walk through the airport and then say, by taking this flower, you have consented to give me $1,000 simply because you took the flower, you're entitled to respond, I agreed to no such thing. There is no agreement to do something unless there is an awareness of the agreement. And another thing, consent cannot be extracted under duress. If I were to point a gun at you and demand that you turn over your money, the fact that you deliberately hand me your wallet doesn't mean that you gave consent, not so long as I'm threatening you with a gun. In the case of the obligation to obey the law, implying consent from the fact that you're still here threatens significant harms if consent is not given. The cost of refusing consent is to give up your home, your friends, your culture, many of the things that most people find very difficult to give up. And this assumes that there's another country out there that'll take you. The type of tacit consent required for political obligation seems to violate both of these requirements. The consent is given without the individual knowing that they're given this tacit consent, and it's given under duress, even if they did have this knowledge. David Hume's criticism of tacit consent is often cited. Quote, "Can we seriously say that a poor peasant or artisan has a free choice to leave his country when he knows no foreign language or manners and lives from day to day by the small wages which he acquires? We may as well assert that a man, by remaining in a vessel, freely consents to the dominion of the master, though he was carried on board while asleep, and must leap into the ocean and perish the moment he leaves her." End quote. Consequently, some consent theorists look for other types of consent. George Klosko next considered hypothetical consent. The way that hypothetical consent works is that you have consented to obey the laws of a political regime if you hypothetically would have consented to live under that regime. Actual consent isn't required, nor does any action or inaction containing the elements necessary for tacit consent. One can hypothetically consent without being aware of the fact and without performing any action. Klosko described hypothetical consent as follows, quote, "If conditions in one's country are such that one would consent to obey the laws if given the opportunity to do so, then this hypothetical consent could ground moral requirements to obey the law." End quote. There are circumstances where some sort of hypothetical consent seems to make sense. For example, I see you standing on the sidewalk. Far above you, workers working on the 27th floor drop some heavy piece of concrete that's going to hit you. Without asking for any sign from you, I grab you by the shirt and yank you out from under the cement just before it hits the sidewalk where you are standing and shatters. I can say that my act is legitimate because you, hypothetically, would have given consent if we had been able to discuss the matter. But can we apply this to political obligation? This type of hypothetical consent assumes that there was no opportunity to get actual consent. A person can't use hypothetical consent if the opportunity for actual consent obtains. Imagine somebody claiming that they have a right to borrow your car or enter your house, or take $100 out of your bank account on the grounds that you would have given your consent if they had asked. Even if this is true, these are not legitimate applications of hypothetical consent. You should ask. Klosko then considers an option presented by David Estlund called normative consent. On this account, we may assume that you have consented to obey the laws if it would have been wrong for you not to consent. Citing Estlund, Klosko considers the following case, quote, "As an example, consider a plane crash. A flight attendant is best positioned to get the passengers out safely if they coordinate their activities in accordance with her directions." End quote. The idea here is that refusing to go along with a plan that would evacuate the plane quickly violates an obligation to other passengers. Such an individual wrongly puts other passengers at risk. By analogy, a failure to go along with the rules and systems that coordinate the activities of individuals in society, for example, a refusal to obey traffic laws, wrongly imposes costs and risks on others. Therefore, one has an obligation to obey the laws. Klosko says that this view has its own objections. The main objection here is that we can fully account for the obligation without adding a separate obligation to obey the flight attendant. One has an obligation not to impede the other passengers in their escape. To do this, one obeys the flight attendant if it is useful in discharging this other obligation. But one disobeys the flight attendant if the flight attendant is making things worse. One's obligation is to helping the other passengers to escape the danger, not to obey the flight attendant. The last type of consent that Klosko considers is what he calls reformist consent. Reformist consent says that since no type of actual or tacit or hypothetical consent works, that we should create a system where people actually give explicit consent to follow the laws. So at the age of 18, one is given an option to make a specific promise to obey the laws or to leave the country. This way, everybody within the country has a moral obligation to obey its laws. He writes, quote, because consent is an especially plausible basis for political obligations, they provide changing political circumstances to allow people expressly to consent. I will refer to these efforts as reformist consent, end quote. But this still doesn't seem to solve one of the significant problems with consent theory. That is the problem of duress. The cost of not consenting is so high that it is unreasonable to believe that consent is being freely given. So you may find yourself in a situation in which you have reason to ask, why do I have an obligation to obey the law? Somebody may answer, because you gave your consent. And you may then respond, and when and how exactly did that happen? And by the way, I feel obligated to point out that we're here talking about the obligation to obey the law. Some things, rape, murder, drunk driving, and the like, are wrong even if there is no law against it, simply in virtue of the harm caused to others.